Thanks very much, Andrew. Well, I make a point of speaking to people who aren't necessarily sympathetic to what I have to say, and I think Andrew might have arranged such an opportunity for me. Forgive me if I'm wrong. So many thanks indeed for that. It's great to be here. Thank you to the audience for leaving your shotguns at the door. The question I'd like to begin with is what do the rest of us, those 99.7% of the population who do not farm, receive in return for farm subsidies? And this in the age of austerity, when essential public services are being cut right, left and centre, when the people at the bottom of society are facing extremely harsh conditions of life, is a very urgent question indeed. For we're spending over £3 billion a year in this country on subsidising farming, which equates to roughly £245 per household per year. Added poignancy is given to this question when you recognise a fact very little known in our society, and one which should be much more widely known, that the bottom 10% of people, the poorest 10% of people in this country, across all forms of taxation, end up paying 45% of their income in tax, whereas the top 10% pay just 33%. So taxation in this country is inherently regressive. Any taxation and any public spending relies on a system which is regressive at its core. So that taxation and spending has to be of particularly good use to those who are paying the highest proportion of their income in tax, who are the poorest of all taxpayers. It acquires further weight when you look at the distribution of this funding, and you see that there are some very, very rich people receiving an awful lot of money every year, sometimes running into the millions. And the persistence of that fact dates back to July 2013, where two very interesting things happened. The first was that the government, the Westminster government, imposed in that month its £26,000 cap on the total benefits that a household could receive, which might sound like quite a lot of money, but when you consider that that might include housing benefit, it might be a large household, it means that in certain parts of the country, people have had to vacate more or less vacate the cities, particularly in London and the southeast, that it's become very, very hard for people with large families to live on what might sound ostensibly like quite a generous cap, £26,000 a year. In the very same month, the Westminster government was in Brussels, Mr. Patterson was fronting this, arguing against a €300,000 cap on the maximum amount of subsidy that a farmer could receive. €300,000 happens to be, or happened to be in July 2013, £260,000. In other words, precisely 10 times the size of the cap which in the same month the government had imposed upon the poorest recipients of benefits. And here it was arguing against a cap of 10 times the size on the richest recipients of benefits, which is what we're talking about when we come to farm subsidies. And indeed it won. So that cap is now discretionary. Governments can impose it if they wish, and unsurprisingly, the Westminster government in England has decided not to impose a cap, with the result that the very biggest landowners are still receiving millions in payments. In fact, the structure of the payment system, now under the basic payment scheme, is almost identical to the structure of the medieval levy known as feudal aid. This was a tax that the vassals paid to the landlords, which was more or less proportional to the amount of land which the landowners possessed. The more land you had, the more tax the vassals had to pay to you. Same structure in the basic payment scheme, as I'm sure you understand. In other words, faced with this astonishingly regressive, grossly unjust distribution, the opposite of land value taxation, where you get the money for owning the land, there will have to be some extremely powerful justifications. In this age of austerity, when there's not enough money for basic public services, for maintaining this extraordinary level of public spending from the poor, often to the exceedingly rich, which takes place under the name of farm subsidies. So let's look at the most common justifications that are put forward. One, of course, is food. Without the subsidies, there'd be less food production. Well, I wonder. Because what I see is that those farmers who are on the productive land, they don't need the subsidies at all. It's money in the bank. They just stash it away. I mean, one of the farmers I know says, my subsidy check is a month's deer stalking in Scotland. Does he need that money? It's an extraordinary thing. And it seems grotesque that we're basically paying farmers in those circumstances to do what they'd already be doing. Here's where it gets controversial, because it hasn't been controversial before. Those farmers who do need the subsidies, who are generally the people on extremely infertile land, produce so little that it makes very little impact on our total food supplies. To give you an example, 76% of the land area of Wales is dedicated to livestock production, almost all of that for meat. It's almost entirely meat production. That's roughly 3/4 of the area of Wales. Wales imports, by value, 7 times as much meat as it exports. This is extremely unproductive agriculture. We're talking about very, very extensive sheep keeping on the whole. In some cases, 1 sheep per 2 hectares. Now, this is not going to feed the people of this country or any other country. And when you consider the hydrological damage that keeping the hills bare, ensuring there are no trees in the hills, which is what sheep do, the downstream damage that creates to the hydrological cycle, causing floods and droughts, not enough water at some times of the year, too much water at other times of the year, with massive impacts often on the arable farmers and the horticulturalists downstream, it could even be the case that in certain parts of the uplands you're causing a net loss in food production. And the more that model of keeping the hills bare is sustained, it's possible that actually the more we lose in terms of food production. Second justification is that of keeping people on the land. How successful has that been? 0.3% of the population of England are farmers. 1.4% of the rural population of England have their own farms. The farm consolidation is taking place at the rate of 2% a year. In other words, the number of farms is falling by 2% a year. This is the fastest rate of consolidation of ownership since the enclosures. It's catastrophic. You know, at this rate, in 50 years' time, there's going to be 1 owner. If we carry on like this, it's a massive loss of people from the land. It's a massive loss of small farmers that's taking place. And of course, there are also huge barriers to entry for new farmers. I've been at the Oxford Real Farming Conference. You probably don't like that name. It suggests that this is the unreal one, but which has been running in parallel this week in Oxford. This is the badge of the Land Workers Alliance, who is generally composed of people trying to get a foothold. They don't want a lot of land. Most of them are horticulturalists. You know, they just want a few hectares, but the land has become so astonishingly expensive, largely because you are paid for owning the land. This incredible prop to house prices, to land prices, sorry, which has been given to the landowners through the subsidy scheme, that it's almost impossible for them to get even that few hectares they need to start. And you know how little money you get from horticultural produce these days. So if you have to take out a bank loan to buy that land, you will never survive. It's just impossible, because the land prices have now become so amazingly high. And broadly speaking, if you meet a young farmer, it's almost certainly the case in this country that they've inherited their farm. That's a profoundly wrong situation, I believe, especially as it's the inheritors who are receiving this extraordinary public money. Now, the trade unions are often criticised for being pale, male and stale, and it's a rather cruel description. And I wish to cast no aspersions at all, but I can't help noticing that this audience does not have a lot of women in it, does not have a lot of people from ethnic minorities, well, most of us are in the second bloom of youth. This is an ageing industry. It's not one which is drawing in either new entrants or, in many cases, keeping the older entrants. And it really seems to refute the idea that the subsidy system is succeeding in keeping people on the land. Where I lived until recently in mid-Wales, there's a catastrophic collapse of the population of land workers there, and indeed of the employment opportunities surrounding the land. And what we see as a result of that is that the shops are closing, the chapels are closing, the schools are closing, most importantly, the pubs are closing. This is a community catastrophe which is taking place because the dominant land use is not actually keeping the community alive. And yet we cling to this dominant land use, as the thing which is going to be the only thing that can work. Well, I believe there might be better options. So we come to the third main reason given for the persistence of subsidies, which is that it enables farmers to be the stewards of the land, the guardians of the countryside, to look after the fabric of the nation on our behalf. And I certainly meet some wonderful farmers, plenty of people who are obviously highly responsible, they've got a long-term view, they do their best to look after the land for future generations, but I'm afraid, and I'm sure you've all seen it too, I see a lot of smash-and-grab agriculture wherever I look. Whichever region of the country I go to, there's some really, really bad practice taking place, and I'm sure in your heart of hearts you'll all admit that you're aware of seeing such things yourself. And this is bad practice which is still in receipt of these huge subsidy checks. And it's an extraordinary thing that while the recipients of benefits at the bottom of society are now so tightly regulated with so many extraordinary hurdles that they have to overcome that even highly disabled people lose their benefits because they're not considered to be sufficiently searching for work. That a man called Mark Wood lived just outside Oxford, within 5 miles of where we were, starved to death in 2013 because he just couldn't navigate these amazingly complex obstacles which were put up for anyone who wants to receive benefits. At the same time, as George Eustice boasts again and again in one meeting after another, the guidance, even the guidance for cross-compliance, let alone the monitoring and enforcement, is being slashed and slashed and slashed again. They boast about this in DEFRA. And this incredible dual standards just boggles my mind. That the people who are receiving the really big tranches of benefits are having the conditions attached to those benefits reduced, and the people who are receiving really tiny amounts of money individually by comparison are having them raised and raised. Deregulation of the rich, re-regulation of the poor. This is not fair. And the results can be seen in many parts of the country. Look at soil erosion, for example. Even Farmers Weekly says that Britain now has a soil erosion crisis and has less than 100 harvests left. Think of the implications.